So by this stage you should have acquired a supervisor and therefore have an idea of the topic area that you're going to be conducting your research on. You're going to develop a research proposal within this topic area, but your proposal needs to be quite specific. So it's important for you to understand the distinction between the research topic and the research question that you actually ask. So a topic area can be quite broad, but research questions are specific things we want to answer within that topic area. So for example, you might be interested in return to play after a particular injury, but there are various questions we can specifically ask about that. What's the best way of rehabilitating after that injury to improve or maximise performance when an athlete returns to play? What about questions relating to the psychological state of the athlete and their confidence in terms of their return to play? There are various specific kinds of questions we can try to develop that fall within a broader research topic. The task this week is going to be to think about how to develop a research question, look at some of the ways in which you can do this, and look at the things that determine whether a research question is a good question or not. You're then going to be feeding back to your supervisor and working with them to try and refine exactly what your research question is. So what are some ways you can go about developing an idea for things that you could ask questions about within your topic area? So you could start off by exploring the literature. A good way to do this is to use databases such as Google Scholar or PubMed and search some key terms related to your topic area, and also include the word review or meta-analysis. And if you want to, you can limit the dates as well so that you can search the more up-to-date recent reviews on the topic. One good thing about review articles is often they will try to summarise the research on a given topic. They will try to draw broad conclusions from that research area, and they will also highlight the strengths and weaknesses of it. As such, they'll be able to identify whether there are current gaps in our knowledge, current issues that need to be addressed within the research literature, and regarding that particular topic. And so you can use those to help you identify problems that you could ask specific questions about. It might be that there's not been any studies on a particular subpopulation, or that all studies that have implemented a particular kind of intervention haven't really reflected the way that intervention is delivered in practice. And so you can start to identify problems in our knowledge that you can then ask questions about. You could also look at recent textbooks. Textbooks offer a similar sort of approach to looking at recent review articles, but you can also get a broader idea of some of the key adjacent topic areas to yours that might help stimulate ideas. Of course, there are always new studies being published, and so it's worthwhile keeping abreast of the current literature, keeping your eye out for new advances that are being reported in new studies. In terms of that as well, you can also look to other recent advances. So, for example, is there new technology that is being used to deliver an intervention? Or are there new diagnostic tools that are being used to identify particular injuries or issues that athletes face? You can pose questions around these specific kinds of things as well. And given that they're recent advances, you'll often find that there's a lack of knowledge around them, so it's a good question to ask. You can also think about your own experience. So you will have spent some time now working in clinic with patients, and you will have had the opportunity to observe those patients, and certain problems may have arisen as you were working with those patients with regards to providing rehabilitation, diagnosing their injuries, understanding their experiences, and so on. So you might look to this to raise questions around that particular topic. You can also think about the modules that you've taken. Maybe you've taken a module on a particular topic area and your lecturer has identified that there is a current problem that needs to be addressed, and you could ask a specific research question around that and design a study aimed at addressing it. Of course, you'll be working closely with a mentor as well, and so working with your mentor, discussing with your supervisor, the existing ideas that they potentially have might also give you some prime ideas for research questions that you can address yourself. Now, often when we're looking to address a problem in research, we're looking to address some kind of gap. And there are various kinds of research gaps that we can look to address. Here are 7 research gaps that have been identified in previous literature, or identified in the literature discussing how to develop research ideas and research questions. So, for example, we have what is known as the evidence gap. In an evidence gap, we typically find that there is contradictory evidence that we need to try and examine from different points of view. So, for example, there may be multiple studies on a topic, but they all report different conclusions. And therefore, the gap in our knowledge is trying to understand why that's the case. Then there's the knowledge gap. It may be that there are certain kinds of findings that we would like to address a problem, but those findings don't actually exist. No one has done research on that topic. And so that gap can be filled by asking a question that's specific to that gap. There's also the practical knowledge gap as well. Oftentimes, particularly in applied field, practitioners are doing things that the researchers not yet had the opportunity to explore. Advances occur in practice far quicker than they do in research, and whilst research begins to inform practice and at least give us an understanding of what really is working and what isn't, oftentimes advancements and innovation comes from practice, and then research looks to evaluate that. So it may be that within a particular field, the professional behaviour and practices of applied practitioners within that area are different to what the research is currently looking at. And so a gap may be to look at addressing that and beginning to try to understand how well those practices are working. There's also a methodology gap. In the methodology gap, it may be the case that contradictory research findings, for example, might be explained by looking at aspects of methodology. Maybe certain studies have been looked at, have been conducted using a particular methodological approach, and so that may explain the contradiction, but someone needs to explore that to begin with. It may also be that there is research specifically aimed at trying to improve our methodologies. So it may be research that looks to examine a particular test, look to see whether it is valid, look to see whether it is reliable. These sorts of things are very important for then helping us address some of the other gaps. We then have the empirical gap. In the empirical gap, it may be again that there are research findings or propositions, particularly of a theoretical nature, but they've yet to be empirically tested or verified. So for example, it may be that there is a background of research that has developed a theory as to why a particular injury may occur, what the causal mechanisms may be, or what the associated factors may be. And this may lead us to pose that a particular kind of intervention, therefore, may help to reduce the risk of that injury. But there's yet to be any research that's actually examined that. And so the empirical gap is the gap where we have yet to actually go out and collect empirical data to test those propositions. We also have the theoretical gap. Within the theoretical gap, it may be that actually there is a lot of applied research. We discussed the distinction between data, phenomena, and theory in a previous week's lecture. It may be that there is a lot of observational empirical data, and yet no one has looked to develop a theory or a framework to cohesively pull that together. No one has looked to infer particular regular phenomena from them, and no one has looked to potentially try to explain those using causal mechanisms and pathways. And so it may be that posing some sort of theory or framework may be a gap that can be addressed. Now, I should note, this sort of gap is not typically the kind of one that will be addressed by an undergraduate research project. These are normally the sorts of things that are established by or developed by established and very experienced researchers who understand really well the nuances of the data and the empirical evidence that has been produced, such that they can attempt to try and develop a robust theory to explain it. Lastly, we have the population gap. The population gap is one where we may have some research on a particular topic area, but that is limited to examination in a particular population. So, for example, a lot of our information regarding exercise prescription comes from studies that have looked at healthy populations. There is often a limitation that exercise prescriptions of specific kinds have not been investigated in clinical populations, or in injured populations, or in populations with existing comorbidities. And so there is a kind of translational gap here where we assume that at present the best knowledge we have is that a certain protocol may work, but it is yet to be actually tested within the population that we want to draw that generalization to. And so population gap research can look to essentially replicate prior research, but in new populations, to see whether the findings translate over to those populations. So, there are various gaps you can look to potentially try and address with your research, but when you're developing a specific question, what are the sorts of criteria you should be looking at to make sure it is a good question? Well, this is what is known as the FINER criteria. So, a research question that is developed according to this will be feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. So, how do we understand whether or not our research question meets these criteria? And what sorts of strategies can we use to try and help achieve those criteria? So, for example, is our question feasible? Well, we may think about the methodology, think about the population that we're going to use, and it may be immediately obvious to us whether or not it's feasible or not. Or we may find that we have to do a little bit of pilot work. We may need to collect a little bit of initial data to see whether or not it is feasible to actually do that study. We may subsequently find that we need to modify our PICO. So you may remember this from the assessment brief. We have population, intervention, comparator, and outcome. It may be that the population is difficult to recruit, and therefore we need to think about a question that addresses a different population. It may be that the intervention is costly or difficult to do, or it takes a long time to deliver, and you do not have the time or resources to be able to deliver it. Similarly, it may be that the comparator also suffers from these issues. It may also be that the outcome measures that you want to look at, we don't have the ability to actually measure yet. It may be because we don't have physically the equipment here, or you may not have the skills or expertise to be able to deliver them, and so you may need to address whether or not those outcome measures are the things you should be looking at. You can look to collaborate, particularly if the study that you're proposing and the research question you're looking at is a little bit overwhelming. For example, if you need to recruit quite a lot of participants, sometimes it can work well if you collaborate with other students. If you collaborate with other students, you can help to collect data together, contribute to one another's projects by aiding them with their testing, with their recruitment, and so on and so forth. You can use this to also learn new skills, and you can spend time consulting with experts as well to try and understand whether or not you need to learn these new skills to develop to deliver your research question feasibly. You might think that instead you should approach less costly designs, outcomes that are easy to collect, populations that are easy to recruit, and so on. Second, is your question interesting? Well, this is an easy one to ask from your own perspective. You can think whether the question interests you as a researcher. You've got to be motivated to actually conduct this study. So it's worth choosing something that actually interests you. But it's also worth thinking about whether or not this is interesting to potential collaborators. Obviously, most research nowadays is conducted in a collaboration, and so I, for example, work with many researchers when conducting studies and lean on their expertise, their resources, and vice versa. And so it's important that a project is interesting to all of those involved in the collaboration. But it's also important to think about the stakeholders of the potential research findings. So, for example, the population that you're studying, or, for example, it may be that there are professional bodies that might have interest in the findings of the study to inform guidelines. You also want to consider, is it novel? Now, novelty for novelty's sake is not necessarily a good idea, and sometimes, as we've discussed, replicating existing research is an important contribution to the research literature. But sometimes novel things are worth pursuing as well, and so it's worth checking the literature to see whether or not what you're planning on doing has been done before. Not necessarily whether it's been done before merely once, but whether it is something that we've got robust knowledge of and whether it's worthwhile spending time and resources on actually pursuing that research question further. There are some areas which we know so well that we don't waste resources on them anymore. You can understand this as well by asking experienced researchers. For example, you can discuss this with your mentor or supervisor as well. You should also consider whether or not your research question is ethical. And for this, it's worth familiarising yourself with relevant professional guidelines from the field that you work within, and it's also worth checking the Ethics Committee guidelines. So the Health Exercise and Sports Science Ethics Committee have sophisticated guidelines around what you can and what you can't do with respect to research for a student project here at Solent University. There will be a link on the SOL page to the Health Exercise and Sports Science Ethics Committee page, and there you can identify the guidelines and have a look at those. Lastly, it's worth thinking about whether or not your research question is even relevant. This sort of ties in with the novelty aspect, but not always. It's important to check the up-to-date literature, and it's important to also be familiar with policy guideline and debates, particularly in applied fields where there are professional societies, for example, such as your own. Again, you can speak with experienced researchers and discuss this with your mentor or supervisor. It's also worth considering, particularly if you're addressing a problem that is a burden for a particular population of interest, for example, injuries, then it's worth considering whether or not this is a prevalent injury and therefore it's worth spending time and resources looking at it, or whether or not it's a very severe injury, something which poses a significant burden on the population that experiences it. So think about the finer criteria when you're developing your research question. And also, lastly, I would say you also need to consider within the assessment brief the kinds of study designs that you're allowed to choose from. Make sure you develop a research question that can be answered using one of these study designs.